Well, one look at the title of this morning's sermon, and you'll see that it may not be appropriate for all of us. In fact, when our nursery is open, when Pam saw the title of this morning's sermon, she decided to head there as well. This morning we're talking about sex, as frankly as the Bible does, and so I need to pray. Lord, we are talking about a subject that is very near to all of our hearts. And you know that in our longings and in our brokenness. And so, Lord, would you meet us there in our longings and in our brokenness? Meet us with yourself and your grace, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, this morning's topic reminds me of the first album that I ever bought and a song from the first album that I ever bought, Salt and Peppa. Not pepper, Peppa. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. Let's talk about sex. Why talk about sex? Well, because sex is everywhere. And it doesn't take much to prove that. Just a scan at the magazines at any of your local checkouts will show you that. And not only is sex everywhere, even though it is everywhere, there's, I feel like, a lot of confusion about sex, both outside and inside of the church. Outside of the church, I think we wrestle with something that I would call sexual schizophrenia. We're told two messages. One message is this: sex is really no big deal. It's as banal as knitting and as natural as eating, and therefore we can embrace free love. And yet, on the other hand, we're also told that we just can't live without wild, titillating, mind-blowing sex. That we have to have it. We can't live without it. Woody Allen once said, "I'm not sure what the question is, but sex is definitely the answer." And I think he's onto something about how our culture approaches sex. We look to sex to actually answer our biggest questions, our deepest longings, our greatest needs. We look to sex for that. So we're told sex is nothing and sex is everything. Which is it? And then I don't think that we're very much more clear inside the church. Inside the church, if we talk about sex at all, which we usually don't, but if we talk about sex at all, then here's what you hear, and you hear it in this order. First you hear sex is wrong and sex is dirty, and then you hear you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage. So the net effect is sex is wrong and dirty, so you should save it for that person you're going to marry. It seems like there's a lot of confusion about sex. We need to talk about sex, and we need to talk about the seventh commandment, which gives us the boundaries of sex. What are the boundaries? Look, it's right there. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. You shall not commit adultery. God's word. Now, on the surface of it, this is pretty innocuous, and most people would agree. Because adultery is simply sex, having sex with someone who is other than your spouse or someone else's spouse. And today, I think most people agree with that. While many in our culture would say, why would you want to be tied down? Most people would say, if you are married, you are tied down to that person. I mean, if someone were to say to a friend, my wife cheated on me, they would say, that is wrong. And so most of us, most of the time, we think that adultery is wrong. Most of us, most of the time, until it's us. Until it's our desires. Until we think the only way we can be happy or fulfilled is outside of this covenant that we've made with this person. But most of us, most of the time, we think that adultery is wrong. We are okay with this commandment on the surface, but like a good British kidney pie, right below the surface, we don't want anything to do with it. And Jesus, he shows us what it means to go below the surface. You heard it read, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 28, in his most famous sermon. He says, "You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." See, Jesus, he pushes this command, and he says there are layers to it. There's an intended depth to it. And he says that actually the heart which seeks, that intends to look after a woman lustfully, this isn't, by the way, just a glance that you see someone and you desire. No, it's to look with the intent to lust. It's the prolonged stare. It's the second look. It's the going with the intent to look. He says this, well, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And notice that he doesn't just restrict this to married couples and married relationships. Verse 28, everyone, male or female, who looks at a woman or a man, married or unmarried, with lustful intent, has already committed adultery. In other words, Jesus is saying that any expression of sexual desire outside of God's design breaks the seventh command. It's committing adultery. And what is God's design? Well, throughout the Bible, it is crystal clear that God's design for sex and sexuality is that it is to be expressed between a man and a woman within the covenant of marriage. Now, if you are new to Christianity, if you are just wandering off the street, if you are checking out Christianity, then you are probably thinking, really? What? Give me a break. No sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman? That is ludicrous. That is repressive. That is outdated. What on earth? Writing almost 70 years ago, C.S. Lewis said that chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. And if it was true 70 years ago, then it's certainly true today. In fact, it was true 2,000 years ago. What people knew about Christians, an old ancient author named Gaius, he knew one thing. They believed in the resurrection of the dead, and they had tremendous sexual restraint. They gave away their money, but they withheld their bodies. Just the opposite of people in that culture. You see, Christian sexual ethic, well, it's never really been popular. It's not that it's outdated. It's just from a different world. But before you go on dismissing Christian sexual ethics, it's worth asking the question, why the boundaries in the first place? Why the boundaries? Well, let me tell you why the boundaries are not given. The boundaries are not given because the Bible is anti-sex or because the Bible is prudish. In fact, when we open up the Bible to the first chapter of the Bible and the first command of the Bible, we are told, be fruitful and multiply. Well, how do you do that? Well, if you don't know, and I'm serious, if you don't know, then please come up after the service and talk to Pastor Paul. The Bible is actually very sexually explicit. You get to the second chapter of the Bible, and naked Adam looks at naked Eve, and he breaks out in song and says, bow chicka bow wow. My translation. And then there's the text that we read in Proverbs, and don't even get me to Song of Solomon. Oh wait, yes, get me to Song of Solomon. A song which celebrates romantic and even erotic love. So let's give an example from Song of Solomon chapter 7. How beautiful are your feet in sandals, O noble daughter. Okay, that's pretty benign. But he goes on. A little higher now. Your rounded thighs are like jewels, the work of a master's hand. Your navel is a rounded bowl that never lacks mixed wine. Your belly is a heap of wheat encircled with lilies. Husbands, learn from my mistake. Don't use that line. It does not work anymore. I tried it. It doesn't work. No woman wants to hear that her belly is a heap of wheat today. Back then, maybe so. That was free. Learn from my mistakes. Your two breasts are like two fawns, the twins of a gazelle. Your neck is like an ivory tower, he goes on. Your stature is like a palm tree. Your breasts are like clusters. I say, I will climb the palm tree. I will lay hold of its fruit. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples. Your mouth like the best wine. It goes down smoothly for my beloved, gliding over lips and teeth. You see, long before the Steve Miller Band, there was the Solomon Singers. And they are very sexually explicit. In fact, I don't think they would be allowed in most Christian bookstores today, except for the fact that it's in God's holy, inerrant, infallible word. Why? Why would this kind of thing be in God's holy, inerrant, infallible word? Well, one reason. Because sex is good. Sex is for pleasure. Sex is a delight. G.K. Chesterton once said, we've talked about this quote before, that in Christianity, rules are given, the boundaries are given to let good things run wild. And in Christianity, the covenant of marriage is given to let good sex run wild. Wait a second. You can't talk like that in church, Kyle. You can't talk like that in church. And what does this have to do with adultery? Everything. Everything, you see, because if we don't talk about it in church, you're going to hear about it somewhere. And most of the time, it's going to be a distortion of God's intention. You're only going to hear what's wrong about sex and to save yourself from marriage, and if those are the only two messages you hear, and then you hear from the culture, sex is good, and this is what it's for, and it's pleasurable, then here's what's going to happen. When you come upon temptation, two visions are going to be set before you. The culture's yes, and the Bible's no. And when all you have is the Bible's no and the culture's yes will always win out. See, you need to know that sex is good. You need to know that it isn't simply the tabloids that are promoting wild sex, but the Bible promotes wild sex, and it tells you actually how to get there within the covenant of marriage. Sex is good, and sex is for our pleasure. Now, I realize that for some of us, when we hear that, it is jarring, and we have an automatic response, and that response is a knee-jerk, And some of us, that our jarring response is because we've never heard this in church before. And for that, I'm sorry. But for some of us, the reason why this jars us is because we have been on the wrong end of the misuse of sex. And if that is you, then I just want to say, I'm sorry. I'm grieved. I'm angry about what happened to you. I am angry. And I think that it's awful. But sometimes, I don't want to make light when I say that sex is good of the tremendous trauma that you have experienced. But sometimes the healing path can only begin when we start to see a vision of what God really intended sex to be. And that's what I need to lay out this morning, that sex is good and that sex is for our pleasure. But that's only one purpose of sex, actually. It's the only purpose that our culture talks about, but we divorce it from these other purposes, which actually the Bible sees as more fundamental, like the purpose of procreation, be fruitful and multiply. It becomes a little difficult to, just embrace free love when the intent of this act is to have a child. It's kind of hard to go pro-casual sex when the potential and the intent of this act is to have a child. Sex is for procreation, but there's an even deeper, more fundamental purpose to sex. And to get to that, we need to go back to the beginning of the story, Genesis chapter 2. So turn to Genesis chapter 2, because we're going to spend most of the rest of the morning here. Genesis chapter 2, 24 and 25. This is just after naked Adam has looked at naked Eve, and he has said, we'll use the ESV translation, "Alas, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And then it says this, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Now, because we live in 2014 and because we aren't Hebrews, we don't see what's here in this text. But you need to understand that the language that's being used here is what we would call covenantal language. That is, when God makes a covenant with Israel, for instance, he tells them not to leave or forsake him, and he tells them to hold fast ardently to the Lord your God. This is covenant language. It is saying that marriage is a covenant. In other words, this is a permanent and exclusive legal commitment for two people to share their entire life with one another. That's what it means when it says one flesh. But how does this happen? How do two people bind their lives to one another? Well, we get a not so subtle hint in the next verse. Verse 25. "And the man and his wife were both naked and unashamed." Unashamed of what? Unashamed of that place that we normally hide. That place that we carry our shame in. You know, every culture has a loincloth. And when you take that place that we normally hide, and when you connect it to another person, another person's body, that place that they normally hide, then something happens. Something happens that the Bible and all the romance novels that have ever been written happen. And that is that more than two bodies are joined. Two lives are joined. See, when you connect yourself to another person like that, you connect to them wholly. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:16, "Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two shall become one flesh." You see, if it's true of a prostitute, then it's true of anyone. When you take that part of you that you normally cover and you connect it to somebody else, that part of them that they normally cover, then something happens. You connect to lives. See, sex is like glue. Covenant super glue. It's a bonding agent. It's for making covenant. It's for reaffirming covenant. It is a covenantal act. And here's what that means. That means that there's actually no such thing as casual sex. We're told in our culture that we can just have sex recreationally, casually, that we cannot have our hearts be involved, and we can just get involved with someone in a merely recreational way. But as Cameron Diaz's character says to Tom Cruise in that awful movie Vanilla Sky, "When you had sex with me, you made a promise with your body." Exactly. And studies are starting to come out to show the damage that our hookup culture is actually doing. I was actually reading a couple years ago in Women's Health magazine where it says, where studies are showing that when two people have sex, even if they're doing it casually, it, quote, binds people together. Exactly. And we didn't have to read the studies. We could just watch Friends. Monica is in a relationship with a character played by Tom Selleck, and they are having casual sex, so they think. And they're talking about it, and they're like, it's just like racquetball. Oh, yeah, like racquetball. Like you have a partner, and you go and you play racquetball, and then you're done, and you go and you can pick it up and do it, this, that, and the other. And they're like, yeah, just like racquetball. And then they get to the end of the conversation, Monica asks, "By the way, you don't play racquetball with anyone else, do you?" So she knows. And we know. We know That when you have sex with someone, it is different than simply when you bump elbows with someone. Because you see, while you can't wear your heart on your sleeve, you do wear it somewhere else. And every one of us, when we share our bed with someone, we inevitably share our heart with them. We become one with them, and the two became one flesh. And that means you cannot, if sex is like covenant superglue, then you cannot become unglued from someone without damage happening. It's like when you try to peel off the sticker from something that you stuck it on a piece of paper and it starts to rip apart. That's what happens. Whenever you have sex with someone other than your spouse or with someone else, after you've bound yourself, you end up inevitably ripping yourself off from that one person and attaching them to another. And it happens over and over and over again. And whenever you divorce, you rip. And this is why God hates adultery, and this is why God hates divorce, and this is why our sexual promiscuity grieves God, because he knows that the more and more we rip and tear and rip and tear and rip and tear, there's this callus that builds up, this thick callus of scar tissue, and we become, it's like foreskin around our hearts, and we become insensitive, and we're unable to give and receive love like we should. And he cries, he weeps when we do these things. Mike Mason, in his book, The Mystery of Marriage, it's a great book to read. It's not practical, but it's phenomenal. And he wrote most of it as a single man. Says this: only within this peculiar two-person sanctuary may some of the normal lies and taboos regarding adult nudity be disregarded or relaxed in perfect freedom of conscience. To be naked with another person is a sort of picture or symbolic demonstration of perfect honesty, perfect trust, perfect giving and commitment. And if the heart is not naked along with the body, then the whole action becomes a lie and a mockery. It becomes an involvement in an absurd and tragic contradiction, the giving of the body, but the withholding of the self. So this requires a setting or structure of perfect surrender in which to take place. It requires the security of the most perfect of reassurances and commitments into which two people can enter, which is no other than the loving contract of marriage. Do you see what Mike Mason is saying? He's saying that when you come together and you uncover that part of you that you normally keep covered, or you bear your shame, that it is a symbolic demonstration of perfect honesty, perfect trust, perfect giving, perfect commitment. See, what are you after in sex? Why are we so obsessed with sex? Well, it's right there in Genesis 2:25. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And of course, that doesn't simply mean that they didn't have clothes on, because they didn't have clothes at that time. It means that they were completely vulnerable, completely known, completely embraced, eternally embraced. And it's what we all long for, to be completely known and completely embraced, and not just completely embraced one day, but to know that after they have seen me, after they have seen my naked shame, tomorrow they're not going to leave, and the next day they're not going to leave, and the next day they're not going to leave. No, they are bound to me. See, our culture tells us that we're horny, but the Bible tells us that we're lonely, and that deep down what we're starving for is intimacy. Douglas Coupland, in his book Life After God, says this: starved for affection, terrified of abandonment, I began to wonder if sex was just another excuse to look deeply into another human being's eyes. starved for affection, terrified of abandonment, I began to wonder if sex was just an excuse to look deeply into another human being's eyes. We starve intimacy. We crave intimacy. And the man and his wife were both naked and were unashamed. And so here's the question in the words of Marcus Mumford. Can you lie next to her and give her your heart as well as your body? And can you lie next to her and confess your love as well as your folly? And can you kneel before the King and say, I'm clean? And it's a question for all of us, especially those of us who are married. See, husbands, are you willing to give her everything? Your time, your fears, your attention, your sacrificial love, as well as your body? And wives, are you willing to entrust him with everything, with your security, with your fears, with respect, with everything, as well as your body? Are you starting to see why Jesus forbids the lustful look? Because what are we doing when we look at someone to lust? Well, here's what we're doing. We want a sense of the intimacy of the covenant of marriage without the vulnerability and the commitment of the covenant of marriage. And what are we doing when we look at pornography? We want a sense of intimacy without the vulnerability and the commitment of the covenant of marriage. And what are we doing when we read a Nicholas Sparks romance novel? A movie that I have not seen, but I'm actually very interested in. And the reason that I'm interested in it and the reason I haven't seen it is the same reason. It has to do with the content. And that movie is Don John. The movie, the plot, the premise is that it's about a guy who meets a girl and he has an addiction. He is addicted to porn. But this girl who he meets, she has an addiction as well. She's addicted to romance dramas. And here's the point. They're both longing for a sense of intimacy, a false sense of intimacy, without the vulnerability and the commitment of the covenant. But here's the lie, and here's the thing. We can never have the intimacy for which we long. We can never have the intimacy that sex was intended to bring, that we look for in sex, without the vulnerability and the commitment of the covenant. And this is why all the impostures leave us unsatisfied. This is why it's never satisfying to have sex with yourself. This is why it's never satisfying to have sex with a prostitute. This is why it's never satisfying. Because it will never give us the intimacy for which we long. Now, some of you at this point, I know, are feeling a sense of shame, maybe, fear, panic, because you realize that you have lived outside of these lines. And some of you, you are disturbed because you don't know how to live in freedom within the lines. Can I just say this? There's not a person in this room, including myself, who is not sexually broken. Not one person. Because all of us have broken hearts. And can I also say this? The God that we worship, yeah, he's in the business of mending broken hearts. And he wants to touch you there. Yes, even there. And he wants to redeem you there, even there. So there is forgiveness and there is redemption, and you can have it. It is yours because of what Jesus has done. But we have to live inside the bounds. So how do we stay within the boundaries? Well, I think the text that was read in Proverbs 5 gives us some good practical help. First thing that we learn is that we have to recognize the lie of sexual immorality. Look at verses 3 and 5. This is a father talking to his son, giving him advice. I wish that more fathers talk to their sons in this way. I do. Don't leave a book on their bed. Don't leave a book on their bed. Talk to your son like this. He says in verses 3 through 5, "For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life." See what it's saying? It's saying recognize the lie. There's a lie that happens where it appears that sexual intimacy outside the covenant of marriage can actually be fulfilling, that you can actually have intimacy outside the covenant of marriage. And there's an attractiveness that if I just connect with this person physically, I'll connect with them emotionally, and it will lead to my satisfaction in my life. But no, the way leads to death. The way leads to death. So recognize the lie. The first thing that we need to do when we are tempted is we need to realize and call out, you are lying about what sex is for because you have divorced it from the covenant. That's the first thing. The second thing is flee sexual temptation. Look, verse 8, "Keep your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house." In other words, get away. Flee sexual temptation. If you struggle with pornography, don't have Wi-Fi in your home. Don't have a laptop. Have your computer in an open place where other people can see it. Limit your access. Don't have a smartphone. Go exercise. Get to a public place. Confess it to your spouse. These are the things that you need to do. Set up accountability, like use a program like Covenant Eyes. Flee sexual immorality. And if you feel that you're getting intimate with someone else of the opposite sex or of the same sex, and you feel that you're getting intimate with them, then here's what you need to do. Confess it to your spouse. Set up boundaries. Only talk with that person in public places with groups and limit the conversation topics. Don't share your heart, because you will share your heart. Recognize the lie of sexual immorality, flee sexual temptation, and then third, nurture the covenant of marriage. Look in verse 15, "Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well." Verse 18, "Rejoice in the wife of your youth." Verse 19, "Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love." See, we don't just run from something, we run to something. We run to our spouse. We run to our covenant partner, and not just sexually, but in every way. We run emotionally. We run with our time. We run with our energy. We run with our sacrifice. We run with our obedience. We run with everything. We give them everything, including our bodies. And then, yes, we have sex. We have sex because Paul says that sex protects from sexual immorality. So, if you're going to be away from one another for a while, think about that. If you have actually, I'm going to get very practical. If you actually have, for instance, you travel for work, and you have got some, if you've got some liberty over what days you take and when you travel, and there's this cycle that happens in a woman's monthly period that happens because of how God has made them, you need to make sure that you line those things up well so that you're not away for too long. Protect yourself. Embrace and nurture the covenant of marriage. So recognize the lie. Flee temptation and nurture the covenant of marriage. But I know some of you are sitting out there and you were not very satisfied with that because you're asking, what about me? What about me, Kyle? I'm single and I still have desires. Or maybe you're like my friend Wesley Hill, who did his doctorate with me and who is a celibate homosexual Christian, who lives a celibate life and gives his sexuality over to Jesus. What about him? What does this sermon have to say to him? Well, Mark Jordan, who's a professor at Washington University said that Christians should keep talking about sex so that they can learn to speak about sex more adequately, that is, more theologically. And I think he's on to something. Because I think that a lot of our confusion and a lot of questions and even a lot of our failure in sex, in this area, it comes from the fact that we don't think about sex very theologically. And I'm not saying that this will answer all the questions, and there's certainly much more to be said for my friend Wesley Hill. If you want to know, he's already said it. Read his book, Washed in Waiting. But I think that a start is at least to start thinking about sex theologically. And what would that look like, to think about sex theologically? Well, I want you to consider something with me. Consider that the key words in the Bible at the beginning of the story and throughout the story, that they're all kind of sexually loaded words. Have you ever noticed that? Words like seed and fruit and communion and knowledge. And even the sign of the covenant that God gives to his people, it's circumcision. I can just imagine Abraham, God, you want to touch me there? That's like touching my heart. Yes, I want to touch you there. And think about this, that the first thing in Genesis 2, the first thing in the creation story that God says was not good, do you know what it was? It was that man was alone. Here it is, we read it in Genesis 2, verse 18. Then the Lord said, it is not good for the man to be alone. See, God sees Adam, he sees him in his loneliness and in his ache, and he says, I'm going to do something about what? Well, he goes on, I will make a helper fit for him. But you know what comes next? It's kind of interesting. Eve doesn't come next. Animals come next. Right after that, God parades all these animals up in front of Adam. And we get to the end after Adam names the bull, and it says this, Genesis 2, verse 20, there was not found a helper fit for him. It's as if all these animals were coming up, all of creation, and Adam was searching throughout the creation, and he was asking this question, are you my helper? Are you my helper? Are you my helper? But there was not found a helper suitable for him, fit for him. And so what happens? Well, God puts Adam asleep. And he does surgery. And out of his bleeding side, he takes a rib. And through that rib, he fashions Eve. And Adam sees Eve, and he says, alas, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then we read this, this is why a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Do you see what it's saying? That Eve, marriage, that this was the cure for Adam's loneliness. This is the helper that is fit for him. Or is it? You know, in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul quotes that verse, that a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And then Paul says this in Ephesians 2:32, this mystery is profound, and I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. Is Eve Adam's helper? Could it be that Eve is not Adam's helper? Well, she didn't prove to be a very fit helper, did she? Because right after this, she goes and she takes the fruit of the tree and she eats it, and then she gives some to Adam. And he didn't prove to be a very fit helper for her either, because he's there, he's silent, and he lets her eat. And then they find out that they're both not very fit for one another, because they realize that they were naked and they were ashamed. And so they hide. But God comes and he covers them. He covers their naked shame with the sacrifice. Who is Adam's helper? You know, it's interesting that word helper most often in the Bible, do you know who it refers to? God. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. Listen to this. Let marriage be held in honor among all. And let the marriage bed, be undefiled. For God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. He goes on. For he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Covenant language. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. Who is your helper? When God looked at Adam and he saw and he empathized with his ache and his loneliness, he said, I will make a helper fit for you. And when he sees you in your ache and your loneliness, he says, I will make a helper fit for you. Who is your helper? Behold, the Lord is my helper. Psalm 54:4. And God has made himself fit for us. Woody Allen, he said that, what was it? Oh, he said, I'm not sure what the question is, but sex is definitely the answer. You know, I think I know what the question was. Are you my helper? Are you my helper? Are you my helper? What are we looking for in sex? Are you my helper? Who is your helper? God is your helper, and he has made himself fit for you because in the person of Jesus Christ, he took on flesh. And then he laid his life down for you sacrificially. And he, through that sacrifice, he covered your shame, your naked shame. And out of his bleeding side, he created you, Eve, his bride, the church. And it was through that he formed a covenant. A marriage covenant, the blood of my covenant, that he might unite himself with you, that he might fill you with life. Oh, don't you see, the Lord is your helper. That's why G.K. Chesterton said that every man who goes up to the door of a brothel and knocks is looking for God. Who is my helper? The Lord is my helper. Jesus is my helper. And here's what this means. It means that every longing that you feel to rest into another, to be complete in another, to be known by another, to be loved by another, to live in covenant with another, it's all about him. And every sappy romance novel that has ever been written, it's all a parody of the romance novel. And every love song that's ever been sung, it's all a parody of the love song. It's all about him. And every act of wild sex that can happen within the covenant of marriage that's based on free, one-way love, it's all about him, union and communion with him. His sex is the symbol. Christ is the substance. Union and communion with him is the substance. Robertson McQuilkin was the president of Columbia Bible College and Seminary. And he had married his wife, Muriel, to commit to her, to love her in sickness and in health, in her naked shame, in every part of her life. Well, Muriel, she contracted Alzheimer's, and he was forced to retire from Columbia Bible College and Seminary as he took care of her for another 25 years. It was his ministry. And he often wondered why the Lord brought it about, and why did he do this, and why am I forced to leave this, to serve this? It doesn't make sense. I was doing so much good work. Well, one day he tells a story about being delayed in the Atlanta airport. He says, once our flight was delayed in Atlanta, and we had to wait a couple hours. Now that's a challenge. Every few minutes, the same questions, the same answers about what we're doing there and when are we going home. And every few minutes, we take a fast-paced walk down the terminal in search of what? Muriel had always been a speed walker. I had to jog to keep up with her. An attractive woman, executive type, sat across from us working diligently on her computer. Once, when she returned from an excursion, she said something without looking up from her papers. Since no one was nearby, I assumed she had spoken to me, or at least mumbled in protest of our constant activity. "Pardon?" I asked. "Oh," she said, "I was just asking myself, will I ever find a man to love me like that?" It's all about him. And you see, your marriage it's to point to his marriage. And your loneliness, it's to point to him. It's all about him. You see, the best marriages, that your life, your marriage, your gender, your longings, your aches, they all point to him. This whole thing, that's why we've been given it. It's a drama in which we play out and point to the world this thing, this reality that the Lord is our helper. It's all about him. It's all to get them to ask, will I ever find a man to love me like that? And so your good marriages is to show and to point to the fact that to get people to ask, will I ever find a man to love me like that? And your bad marriages, especially your bad marriages, and your loneliness and your singleness, they're to point to your aches and your longings are to point to the fact that people ask, will I ever find a man to love me like that, to love me like the one he or she longs for? Will I ever? It's all about him. It all points to him. Will I ever find a man to love me like that? And you will. You will. Isaiah 54:1, sing, O barren woman who did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. Fear not, for you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, for you will not be disgraced, for you will forget the shame of your youth, and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. For the Lord, your Maker, he is your husband, the Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Who is my helper? And the two shall become one flesh. This mystery, it's profound. But I am speaking of Christ and the church. Amen.